October 28, 5:41 p.m., 39 degrees. Freezing rain blowing sideways across the drowned road. And the first thing Luke Barrett saw was not the dog's ribs, or the mud caked to his legs, or the torn strip of red fabric hanging from his collar. It was the way the black-antenned German Shepherd stood in the middle of the washed-out service road and refused to move even when Luke's truck rolled within 20 feet of him.
Oh God.
The dog did not flinch from the headlights. He did not run like a stray. He stared straight through the rain at Luke with a kind of frantic intelligence that made the old seal's hands tighten on the steering wheel before his mind had caught up. Then the shepherd spun, sprinted toward the tree line, stopped, looked back, and barked once so sharply it cut through the storm like a shot. If this doesn't hook you, nothing will, because Luke had spent 12 years in teams learning the difference between chaos and intent. And that dog was not acting lost. He was trying to pull a stranger towards something that could not wait. Stay with this, because by the time Luke saw what the shepherd was leading him to, turning around was no longer an option. Luke killed the engine and listened. Rain drummed the hood. Wind hissed through the naked branches.
It says Mason Reed's death
Far
wasn't
below
an
the
accident.
ridge, black reservoir
murder.
water slammed
All this
against
time I
flooded
blame
timber
myself.
with a heavy,
But it
hungry
changes
rhythm.
everything.
The dog barked again, ran deeper into the woods, then came back, splashing through mud to within arm's reach before darting away a second time. "Easy," Luke muttered, stepping out into the cold. The shepherd's coat was slick with rain, but beneath the dirt Luke could see strength in him. Old training in the way he planted his feet, checked Luke's face, then turned to make sure he was being followed. Not wild. Not random. The kind of controlled urgency Luke remembered from deployment dogs that knew exactly when human hesitation became dangerous. He shut the truck door, pulled his collar up, and followed. The slope down from the road had once been gravel, maybe part of an old county access trail, but years of neglect and 2 straight weeks of mountain rain had turned it into a dark ribbon of slick clay between drowned pines. The shepherd moved fast, then slowed whenever Luke lost footing, then pushed forward again, always glancing back, always making sure he stayed on line. That hit Luke harder than it should have. 8 years retired, and some part of him still responded to that kind of movement more honestly than it responded to people. He noticed everything on the way down because stress had always sharpened him instead of blurring him. Fresh tire grooves sliding off the edge of the old road, bark stripped off a cedar trunk at door height, a broken taillight fragment glittering red in the mud, and one child-sized sneaker lying half-buried near the runoff ditch with its laces tied together, as if somebody had once hung it somewhere safe and failed. Luke stopped dead at that. The shepherd came back instantly, nudged his wrist, and barked toward the water below. New clue. New fear. Luke shoved the small sneaker into his jacket pocket and moved again. The trees thinned without warning, and the hillside dropped into a flooded clearing where the reservoir had swallowed the old picnic pull-off, half the boat ramp, and 3 dead cottonwoods standing knee-deep in black water like men too tired to fall. The dog splashed straight into the shallows. Luke followed 3 steps, then froze as his boots found the torn edge of a steel guardrail bent outward toward the water. Not rust-broken. Hit. Hard. Fresh scrape marks shone silver through the rain. Luke swept the shoreline once, heartbeat starting to punch harder now. Oil floated in thin ribbons across the surface. Plastic toys bobbed in the reeds 10 yards out. The shepherd was chest-deep already, barking at one exact spot beyond a patch of drowned brush, where the water looked darker than the rest. "No!" Luke breathed, because his body knew before his eyes fully did. Then lightning flashed far up the canyon, and in that cold 1-second glare, he saw the shape below the waterline. A van. Nose down. Rear quarter twisted sideways under the surface, one corner barely visible through the rain-blurred reservoir skin, as if the whole vehicle had slid through the guardrail and been swallowed before anyone could scream loud enough. The shepherd dove. Luke's stomach dropped. The dog vanished beneath the surface, then came up beside the rear window thrashing, clawing, barking with a desperation that turned the whole scene from awful into immediate. Luke was moving before he fully knew he had chosen to. He waited in hard, freezing water slamming his thighs, breath turning ragged as the cold climbed fast. Water had always been the one thing he respected more than bullets. Bullets announced themselves. Water smiled and kept pulling. The last time he had gone under after a trapped vehicle, a teammate had died with Luke's gloved hand still locked around the harness that should have brought him back. He still woke hearing metal buckle under black water. He still remembered how his lungs had burned while command screamed abort in his ear. The shepherd barked again, snapping him out of it. "I'm here," Luke said, though he was not sure whether he meant the dog or himself. He got close enough to touch the van, and felt the current pressing along its frame. It was deeper than it looked, the rear window just below the surface, the whole body tilted down into some unseen drop beyond the flooded ramp. He wiped rain from his eyes, and forced himself to look cleanly. Family van. Dark blue, maybe black. Rear glass spider cracked from the inside. One roof rack bent. Sliding door partially buckled. A faded stick figure family decal still clinging to the back corner. The shepherd surfaced with something in his mouth and shoved it at Luke's chest. Red ribbon. Wet, tangled, tied around the child's hair elastic. Luke went completely still. The dog barked in his face, then turned back to the van and hit the rear glass with both paws. Not random. Not grief. Command? Luke dug his phone out, tried for signal, got one flickering bar, and then nothing. He cursed once, shoved it back, stripped off his jacket, and sucked in one hard breath. Rain hit the water. Wind hit the trees. Somewhere far across the reservoir a metal buoy bell clanged once in the storm, like something marking time. "On 3!" he muttered to nobody. The shepherd held position at the van like he understood every word. 1, 2. Luke dove. The cold hit like a fist to the ribs. Visibility vanished after the first foot, turning the reservoir into black soup full of silt and drifting weeds. He found the rear window by touch, swept along the cracked lines, then angled his flashlight through the fractured corner. For half a second he saw only floating wrappers, a child's seat turned sideways, a blanket waving like trapped smoke. Then the beam hid movement. Not outside. Inside. A hand. Small. Pale. Pressed against the inside glass from an air pocket somewhere higher in the cabin. Luke surged back to the surface so hard he nearly swallowed half the reservoir. The shepherd was barking before he broke through. Luke wiped water from his face, dragged in air, and stared at the van in total disbelief, because he had seen that hand, and a second later, from somewhere inside the submerged vehicle, muffled by water and cracked glass, but real enough to stop his heart cold, came two faint knocks from within. Luke did not waste the second knock. He sucked one hard breath into his lungs, yanked the tire iron from the back of the truck, and splashed straight for the rear corner of the van while the black-antenned shepherd kept hurling himself against the cracked glass like he was trying to tear time open with his own body. The water hit Luke's waist, then his ribs, then the underside of his arms, cold enough to turn his breath into knives. He reached the rear window, planted one boot against the bed bumper, and smashed the tire iron into the spider-cracked corner twice. The first hit only deepened the fracture lines. The second punched a hole through, and dark reservoir water surged into the cabin with a heavy sucking sound that made his gut knot. The shepherd dove again before Luke could even clear the rest of the glass, vanished beneath the surface, and came up at the side door barking frantically at the same spot. New clue. New angle. Luke jammed the iron into the shattered rear frame, ripped away enough glass to force a shoulder through, then dove headfirst into the freezing black. Inside, the van felt upside down even though it wasn't. Blankets drifted. A backpack spun slowly through the water. The beam from his dive light found a teenage girl trapped high against the rear seat pocket with her face tilted into a shrinking wedge of air. 16 maybe. Soaked brown hair plastered to her cheeks. Eyes huge with panic and effort. One hand had been the hand knocking. The other was clamped around a dog collar strap looped through the rear seat latch as if she had been trying to hold on to something that had already escaped. Luke cut the strap, grabbed her under the arms, and shoved her toward the broken rear window. She kicked once, weakly, then harder when her body understood escape before her mind did. The shepherd surfaced on the other side, and snapped into place against the van like he knew exactly where to be. Luke pushed the girl out through the jagged opening, followed a second later, and broke the surface with her weight half across his chest and reservoir water burning in his throat. The dog was right there, circling, barking, nudging the girl's shoulder as if counting breaths. Luke dragged her backward through the shallows until his boots found gravel. She hit mud, coughing so violently her whole body folded around it. He rolled her, cleared her airway, pressed 2 fingers to her neck, and felt a pulse, weak but there. "Stay with me," he snapped, voice rough from cold and adrenaline. Her eyelids fluttered. She looked at the dog first. Not Luke. "Ranger," she whispered, and the shepherd's body changed at once. Not stray. Not random. Named. Known. Ranger whined once, shoved his head under her shaking hand, then whipped around toward the van again and barked with renewed fury. Luke followed the line of his stare. The front half of the vehicle had sunk lower while he was pulling her out. The windshield was gone. The driver's seat was empty. Not simply empty, wrong. The seat belt had been sliced clean. Blood smeared the inside of the door frame. Someone had gotten pulled out through the front before the van finished going under. "Who else was in there?" Luke asked. The girl fought for air, coughed water onto the mud, and forced the words out between shivers. "My dad." She pointed with a trembling hand toward the van, then past it, toward the darker water near the drowned boat ramp. "They took him. He was alive when they took him." Discovery hit so hard it almost stopped Luke cold. This was no simple crash, no bad road and rain and panic. Somebody had forced the van through the guardrail. Somebody had gone into the water after it, and somebody had been organized enough to remove one adult while leaving the girl to drown. Ranger barked again, harder now, and lunged toward the van's front quarter. Luke saw a slim shape wedged under the side mirror, barely visible under the water. He went back in without thinking. One quick breath, then down. The shape turned out to be a waterproof phone pouch clipped to the mirror arm with a bright orange carabiner. He tore it free, kicked off the sinking frame, and came back up shivering so hard his teeth hurt. The girl was sitting now, barely, with Ranger braced against her side to keep her upright. Luke shoved the pouch into his jacket and dropped beside her. "What's your name?" "Avery." Her lips were blue. "Avery Quinn." "I'm Luke Barrett." Her eyes sharpened through the shock at that, and for 1 second he saw recognition cut through terror. "I know," she said. "Dad said if anything happened and Ranger found you, you'd be the one who wouldn't stop." That landed deeper than he wanted it to. Luke's hands kept moving anyway. He stripped off his thermal overshirt, wrapped it around her shoulders, and tried the phone in the pouch. Water had not killed it yet. The lock screen flared to life under rain. A missed call screen. A map pin. One unsaid draft message. He stared at it. Luke Barrett. South Intake. Don't trust Dean. The name hit with a second shock. Dean Holloway. County Sheriff. The man who had signed Luke's old dive permit renewals and shaken his hand at veteran breakfasts. Avery saw his expression and grabbed his sleeve with surprising force. "Don't call him!" she said, voice suddenly fierce despite the tremor in it. He did this. Him and the man with the scar on his neck. They chased us off the road. New clue. New danger. Luke looked up at the reservoir ridge. Headlights swung once through the rain up by the old access road, then disappeared behind the trees. Ranger froze so hard he seemed carved from the storm itself. His ears went high. His growl began low and deep and immediate. Avery heard it too, and turned toward the ridge with pure terror in her face. That's them, she whispered. They came back to make sure we sank. Luke rose in one motion, hauled Avery up with him, and shoved the phone into his jacket as Ranger barked into the rain with the kind of warning that meant whatever was coming this time was close enough to smell. Luke got Avery moving before the headlights found the waterline again. He hooked her arm over his shoulder, kept one hand at her back to stop her from collapsing, and pulled her toward the truck while Ranger ran 3 steps ahead, then 2 steps back, herding them in a tight, urgent line through the mud. Rain hammered the reservoir so hard it flattened the oil slick into shifting black ribbons. Halfway up the slope, Luke heard the first engine door slam. Then another. Not hurried. Not rescue. The kind of movement men used when they thought the people they were hunting had nowhere left to go. Ranger barked once behind them, sharply enough to make Luke turn. 2 flashlight beams had appeared at the ridge, both held low. One man shouted through the rain, "Sheriff's office! We've got you! Bring the girl up slow!" Avery nearly folded where she stood. "No," she gasped. No, don't let them." Luke did not wait for the sentence. He cut right instead of up, dragging her along the drowned fence line toward the old campground road where the pines thickened and the flood channel bent toward the abandoned bait shack. "Can you run?" he asked. "If I fall, don't stop," she said automatically, and that told him more about the last 20 minutes than any explanation would have. Ranger peeled off into the brush, vanished, then barked from somewhere parallel to them, not panicked, just marking the better covered line. Luke followed the sound. Behind them, one of the men at the ridge realized the prey had broken the expected direction. "East side," he shouted. "They're cutting east." A beam swept the slope. Avery slipped in the mud and nearly went down. Luke caught her, shoved her behind a cedar trunk, and finally saw the first face through the rain, not Dean Holloway, but one of the sheriff's deputies, a thick-set man Luke recognized from the gas station on Route 9. Deputy Carl Sutter. Local. Familiar. Rifle in his hands. No badge light. No siren. No rescue urgency. Just a clean hunting posture and a flashlight moving with the barrel. Ranger exploded from the brush before the deputy finished sighting. The dog hit him at knee height and sent the rifle wide as the shot broke. Bark and thunder and gunfire merged into one brutal instant. Luke drew the pistol from the small of his back, shoved Avery lower behind the cedar, and sighted on the second light approaching from the ridge. "Drop it!" he barked. The beam stopped. A voice came back through the rain, calm and almost annoyed. "You're making this uglier than it has to be, Barrett." Scar on the neck. Avery had said that. Luke couldn't see the speaker's face yet, but he saw the silhouette, taller than Sutter, leaner, advancing without hunching under the weather, one hand on a shotgun, the other steadying the flashlight. Ranger tore free of Sutter and bounded back toward Luke the second the deputy hit the mud. Smart dog. Not chasing. Covering. "Keep moving," Luke said to Avery, and the 3 of them broke right again through flooded brush toward the bait shack, a low collapsing structure on concrete stilts above the old channel. Another shot crashed through the rain and stripped bark from the trunk beside Luke's head. Sutter had recovered the rifle. Luke fired once blind toward the muzzle flash, heard a curse, then shoved Avery up the shack steps. The building smelled like wet wood, dead fish, and mold old enough to vote. but it had walls, 2 windows, and 1 broken trapdoor in the floor opening toward the drainage culvert below. Ranger spun in a full circle inside, checked both windows, then planted at the west wall and growled. Luke peered through the slats. Flashlights were spreading out below. Not rushing anymore. Surrounding. Avery wrapped both arms around herself and shook so hard the whole bench trembled under her. "My dad knew," she said. "He knew Dean wouldn't let us leave town." Luke kept watching the lights. "Start talking." She swallowed. Rainwater ran off her jaw onto the old floorboards. "My dad used to work maintenance for the reservoir district. Not the county. The rail gate systems. He found release logs that didn't match the storms on the books. Night releases. Private test cycles. Water moved when nobody reported it. Then people started dying in accidents near the reservoir. Cars. A fishing boat. 1 rescue diver." Luke went perfectly still. "What did you say?" Avery looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time. "Mason Reed," she whispered. "My dad said he died because he found something under the water that wasn't supposed to be there." Emotional pull landed like a gut punch under all the tactical noise. Mason Reed had been the last man Luke had dived beside before quitting county search and rescue. Mason had gone under a flooded access tunnel during a so-called unexpected surge release, and Luke had lived ever since with the exact memory of losing hold of his arm in black water. He had told himself 100 different versions of that death, because the true one had always ended with his own failure. Ranger pressed against Luke's thigh hard enough to break the spiral before it swallowed him. "Stay here. Stay now." Down below, a vehicle door slammed. Then a voice Luke recognized with horrible clarity rolled through the rain from somewhere near the boat ramp. Sheriff Dean Holloway. "Luke," he called. "I know that's you in there. Bring the girl out, and we can still call this a rescue gone bad." Ranger bared every tooth he had. Avery made a sound somewhere between sobbing and rage. Luke crouched lower and scanned the shoreline. A John boat sat nosed into the reeds with its trolling motor idling low. Dean stood beside it under a dark slicker, hat brim dripping, one hand on a megaphone, the other hanging easy by his side, as if this were a weather briefing instead of a manhunt. The tall one with the scar was on the far side of the boat, shotgun loose at his leg. Sutter was back on his feet with a rifle, and a bloody tear in his rain pants where Ranger had gone through him. 3 men. 1 trap shack. Reservoir on one side. Rising channel on the other. Then Luke heard it. A deep metallic grind from somewhere far across the water, followed by a shift in the reservoir's rhythm. The surface below the shack changed. It didn't simply slap and rain. It pulled. Avery heard it too. "The south gate," she whispered. "He's opening the south gate." Dean lifted the megaphone. "You've got maybe 4 minutes before this whole channel goes under," he called. "Make the smart choice." Luke looked down through the broken trapdoor into the dark culvert beneath the shack. Water was already running faster under the boards than it had 30 seconds earlier. Ranger swung from Dean's voice to the trapdoor and barked once, hard. Not surrender. Route. Another way out. Luke looked back at Dean, at the boat, at the rifle angles, then at the rising black water under the floor. 4 minutes. Maybe less. He shoved the bench against the door, dropped to one knee by the trap opening, and aimed the flashlight into the culvert just as something metallic knocked twice from somewhere deep inside the drainage tunnel, followed by the sound of water surging much faster than it should have. High danger had just found a new door. Luke went through the trap first because that was what men like him did when the world narrowed to one bad option and one worse one. He lowered himself through the rotten opening, boots splashing into shin-deep runoff under the bait shack, then turned and lifted Avery down beside him while Ranger dropped without hesitation and landed already facing the dark culvert as if he'd known this was their exit before the water even changed. The drainage tunnel ahead was an old survey run, half concrete, half stone, just tall enough to move crouched if the water stayed where it was. The problem was the water wasn't staying anywhere. Every second the pull under their legs grew stronger, as the south gate release built pressure somewhere down reservoir. "Move!" Luke said. Ranger was already moving. The dog splashed into the culvert 3 lengths ahead, stopped at a fork in the tunnel, looked back once, then took the narrower right branch without waiting. Of course. Always the line nobody trusted on first sight. Luke followed. Behind them a shot broke through the shack floor, punching splinters through the trap opening they had just cleared. Dean had figured out their route. The culvert narrowed, bent twice, then rose into an old inspection alcove above the waterline where rusted tools, flood maps, and a dead control panel still clung to the walls. Ranger went straight to a metal locker in the corner and barked once. Luke ignored it for 1 second, listening instead to the men behind them entering the culvert mouth. Boots. Careful. Slower than before. Dean wasn't rattled. That made him worse. "What's in the locker?" Avery asked, voice shaking. Luke ripped it open. Inside sat a first aid box wrapped in plastic, a storm lantern, and a sealed manila envelope with his name written on the front in block letters so shaky they looked written in the dark. Luke Barrett. New clue. New wound. He tore it open. Inside was a single flash drive taped to a folded letter. Grant Quinn's handwriting. The words were short. Brutal. If Avery reaches you, then the surge that killed Mason Reed was deliberate. They opened south intake 22 minutes early. He found the van shelf under the east basin first. They murdered him after he surfaced. Luke stared. The tunnel around him disappeared. Mason Reed came back in one horrible bright flash. The dive mask, the muddy current, Mason's hand slamming the flooded access pipe and pointing, not at the victim vehicle they had been sent to search, but deeper into the silt shelf below. Luke had yanked him once hard, trying to bring him back up before the surge hit. Mason had tried to say something through the regulator, something urgent. Then the current had punched through the pipe like a living thing and taken him away. For 3 years Luke had lived inside the lie that he was 1 second too slow. Grant's letter ripped that open and left the uglier truth underneath. Mason had not died in an accident. He had been silenced. Ranger felt it immediately. The dog came close, shoved his wet muzzle against Luke's wrist, then looked toward the tunnel mouth where the boot sounds were coming closer. "Stay here. Stay now." Avery took the letter with shaking fingers and read enough to understand before her face collapsed. "Dad told him," she whispered. "He told him Mason saw something underwater. That's why they started watching us." Luke plugged the flash drive into Grant's phone with numb hands. A video file opened instantly. Grainy. Night vision. Reservoir catwalk. Mason Reed in county dive gear, mask pushed to his head, alive and furious, standing under a floodlight while somebody off-camera shouted at him to hand something over. Mason lifted one hand toward the lens and yelled, "There are more vehicles down there!" The clip glitched. Then Sheriff Dean Holloway stepped into frame, younger by 3 years but unmistakable, grabbed Mason by the shoulder, and shoved him toward the dark water as the recording cut. Avery covered her mouth. Luke felt something inside him turn from grief into direction. Mason had not vanished into weather. Mason had been killed after surfacing, and Luke had carried the wrong blame ever since. The machinery under the floor changed pitch again. Worse this time. The brake handle in Avery's grip bucked violently. "Luke!" she screamed. He looked down just in time to see the side sluice lever slipping from its locked catch. The intake pull was about to surge back to full force, with Grant only half freed and Avery exposed on the floor with the entire proof bag in her hands. Ranger suddenly spun from the locker and barked into the far wall, not the door, not the windows. Luke crossed fast and heard it too. A metallic tapping inside the pipe housing. Then a muffled human shout carried through the steel. Grant. Alive. Somewhere inside the intake tunnel system below the pump house. Ranger barked harder, paws on the wall, while Luke found the maintenance hatch wheel beside the pipe junction. The wheel was jammed. Rusted. The water below kept rising. Behind them, through the lower culvert they had just climbed out of, flashlight beams jittered against the concrete. Dean's men were in the tunnel now. Luke put both hands on the hatch wheel and heaved. It moved 1 inch with a scream of metal, then stuck again. Ranger barked toward the wall. Grant pounded from inside. Avery looked from the lights in the culvert to the hatch to Luke, and for the first time all night her voice sounded less terrified than furious. "If they get here first," she said, "they kill him." Luke set his boots, ignored the burn in his shoulders, and drove the wheel again. This time it gave hard enough to nearly throw him sideways. The hatch popped 3 inches open. Freezing spray exploded through the seam, and from the darkness below, unmistakable now, came her father's shredded voice roaring up through the pipe. "Luke, do not let Dean open the secondary gate." Then the first flashlight beam hit the pump house floor behind them, and Dean Holloway's calm voice rolled into the room with enough confidence to chill it further. "Too late," he said. "I already did." The secondary gate release began with sound before it showed itself. A deep steel groan under the pump house floor, then a violent surge in the intake roar that made every hanging chain and dead gauge in the building shudder like loose teeth. Luke turned from the half-open hatch just long enough to see 3 lights pouring out of the culvert mouth below the catwalk. Dean first, raincoat dark with tunnel water, pistol up and steady. Carl Sutter behind him with the rifle back in his hands. And the tall man with the neck scar bringing up the rear, with a shotgun tucked into his shoulder, as if he had all night. Dean did not even look winded. "You keep making this dramatic," he said, almost conversational over the machinery. Ranger exploded into barking, launched down the catwalk steps, then stopped halfway when Luke snapped his fingers once. Good dog. Not because he obeyed blindly, but because he understood angles. Luke looked down at the hatch wheel, then at the roaring intake below, then at Grant's hand suddenly thrust through the 3-inch gap from inside the pipe chamber, fingers bloodied from pounding steel. Not enough space to pull him out. Not enough time to fight and free him clean. "Avery," he said without turning. "Case. Phone. Flash drives. Get to the upper service ladder if I tell you." She did not answer with fear. She answered by grabbing the waterproof case and backing toward the rusted ladder bolted up the wall. Dean saw that movement instantly. "Don't let the girl leave with the box," he said, and Sutter started to raise the rifle. Ranger moved before Luke did. The black-antenned Shepherd launched off the catwalk railing straight into Sutter's chest, hit him high, and drove both man and rifle into the lower guard chain. The shot broke wild into the roof. Luke fired at the Scarneck man a split second later, caught him in the shoulder, and sent the shotgun spinning across the wet concrete. Dean dropped flat behind the pump console with a speed that told Luke he had been in bad rooms before. No wasted motion. New clue. New suspicion. Not just a corrupt sheriff. A man who knew how to hunt under pressure. Luke shoved the bench against the door, dropped to one knee by the trap opening, and aimed the flashlight into the culvert just as something metallic knocked twice from somewhere deep inside the drainage tunnel, followed by the sound of water surging much faster than it should have. High danger had just found a new door. Luke shoved Avery the dead revolver anyway, got Grant's arm over the stair rail, and ran for the underfloor hatch as Ranger took Dean's path away with a snarl that promised the sheriff one thing only, that if he wanted to keep writing endings with water, he would have to step through the dog to do it. Luke went for the hatch, but Dean fired first. The round hit the hatch ring inches from Avery's face and showered both of them in rust. Ranger snarled below. Luke crossed to the hatch, jammed both hands into the opening, and pulled. Grant Quinn's face appeared in the gap, gray with cold, one side cut open, lips blue, body trapped somewhere lower by more than simple bad luck. "Great!" he gasped. "Leg caught in the lower cage." Luke saw it in one flash of his light. Grant wedged in a submerged maintenance basket just below the pipe chamber lip. One ankle twisted through a broken grate section while black water hammered past him toward the open gate. If Luke cut the grate wrong, Grant would be gone into the intake throat before either of them could blink. Avery knelt beside Luke without being told and grabbed the emergency release handle on the side panel. "What do I do?" He almost said run. Instead he said, "When I say break, you pull and hold." Dean fired from behind the console. The round hit the hatch ring inches from Avery's face and showered both of them in rust. Ranger snarled below. Grant's grip was slipping. "Luke," he said, and the way he said it told Luke there was more to this than rescue. "Drive, not enough. Not now. You need the manifest behind the west gauge panel," Grant forced out. "Vehicle numbers. Names. Dates." Dean shouted from cover. "You open that hatch any farther, and he dies faster." Luke believed him. That was the worst part, because he had already seen the current. The bigger mystery was not whether Dean could kill. It was how long he had been arranging deaths around moving water and calling it weather afterward. Ranger solved the next piece. He left Sutter bleeding and half wrapped in guard chain, sprinted past the fallen Scarneck man without finishing him, and went straight to the west wall panel Grant had named. One bark. One scratch. Exact? Luke stared once, then understood. Of course Grant had hidden something there. Of course the dog knew the scent of the man who had fed him, trusted him, sent him after help. "Avery panel," Luke said. She ran to it. Dean saw and fired again. Luke returned 2 shots fast enough to keep the sheriff's head down, while Avery ripped the rusted cover loose. Behind it sat a sealed ledger bag the size of a legal file wrapped in orange tape. She held it up, eyes wide. "Got it!" Rehook. More proof. More danger. The Scarneck man recovered faster than Luke wanted, seized the shotgun, and started leveling it at Avery. Ranger hit him a second time, this time low at the knee, and the blast went into the ceiling with enough force to shower everyone in dust and rotten insulation. By seconds. Use them. Grant's grip was slipping. "Grant!" Luke shouted. The trapped man's response was a cough, and a look Luke did not want. Then he said, "If this goes bad, get Avery out." Luke ignored the words and moved. He dove halfway through the hatch opening, got one arm around Grant's chest, and reached down with the other for the bent grate. "Break!" he yelled. Avery yanked the handle. The side sluice shutters clanged, halfway closed, and the intake pull dropped just enough for one human breath. Luke used it. He bent the grate with everything he had, heard metal scream, heard Grant cry out, then felt the trapped ankle tear free. Good. Bad. No choice. He hauled Grant upward. As the Scarneck man roared through blood and pain, Dean shouted something lost under machinery, and Ranger barked with savage urgency from somewhere behind Luke's shoulder. Grant came halfway out of the hatch, then stopped dead at the hips. His harness strap caught on something below. Luke looked down. A chain. Not an accident. A restrained hook clipped to the lower cage ring. Somebody had left Grant there alive on purpose, pinned in the intake as bait in case the van failed. Mystery deepened again, uglier this time. Dean stood from behind the console, seeing Luke see it, and his face held no panic at all. only certainty. He was never the target, Dean said. He was the lure. Avery froze. Grant looked up at Luke with pure exhausted apology in his face. I knew only one man would come back into water after what happened to Mason, he whispered. The words hit like a blunt object. Emotional and cold and brutal. Grant had not just hidden evidence. He had aimed it. Aimed the dog. Aimed Luke. Used the old wound because he knew it would work. Dean smiled as the understanding landed. There it is, he said softly. The part where you realize everybody used you tonight. The machinery under the floor changed pitch again. The brake handle in Avery's grip bucked violently. Luke! She screamed. He looked down just in time to see the side sluice lever slipping from its locked catch. The intake pull was about to surge back to full force, with Grant only half freed and Avery exposed on the floor with the entire proof bag in her hands. Ranger swung from Dean's voice to the trapdoor and barked once, hard. Not surrender. Route. Another way out. Luke looked back at Dean, at the boat, at the rifle angles, then at the rising black water under the floor. 4 minutes. Maybe less. He shoved the bench against the door, dropped to one knee by the trap opening, and aimed the flashlight into the culvert just as something metallic knocked twice from somewhere deep inside the drainage tunnel, followed by the sound of water surging much faster than it should have. High danger had just found a new door. Luke made the wrong choice first, and that was why this part hurt. He chose Grant. Maybe because the man was already in his hands. Maybe because the water was already trying to take him. Maybe because Luke had spent too many years failing to hold on to drowning men and his body reacted before his strategy did. He pulled hard, braced a boot against the hatch lip, and got Grant's chest and one shoulder free just as the brake lever tore out of Avery's grip and the side sluice shutter snapped open again with a steel shriek. The current below the hatch went monstrous. It yanked Grant downward so violently Luke felt something pop in his own shoulder. At the same instant Dean fired, not at Luke, but at the overhead flood lamp. The bulb exploded. Half the pump house plunged into strobing darkness, lit only by the emergency control lights and the pale storm through the broken windows. Ranger barked once, desperate and directional, but Luke saw the danger a fraction too late. The Scarneck man, bleeding and limping but still in the fight, came up off the floor behind Avery and slammed her into the west wall before she could reach the ladder. The ledger bag flew from her hands. No! Luke shouted. He let go of Grant for half a second, just half, and that half second was enough. The current tore Grant back through the hatch to his waist. His head hit the pipe rim with a sickening crack. The man disappeared below the lip again, with only one hand still reaching. Failure arrived in 3 directions at once. Avery screamed as the Scarneck man locked one arm around her throat and dragged her backward toward the culvert stairs. Dean lunged from behind the console and snatched the ledger bag off the floor. And Ranger launched, not at the sheriff or at the man with Avery, but toward the hatch where Grant's fingers were sliding out of sight. The dog hit the lip, leaned dangerously far into the roaring chamber, and barked as if sound alone could keep a human from being swallowed. Luke grabbed for Grant again and managed to catch 2 fingers, nothing more. Pain ripped through his shoulder. Water hammered the trapped man backward. Grant looked up through spray and darkness and said the worst possible thing in that moment. Take my daughter! Luke's grip broke. Grant vanished beneath the hatch lip and the pipe chamber filled with black water, noise, and empty space. Luke heard Avery make a sound he knew he would hear again later in quieter places. Dean did not even look at the hatch. He had the proof in one hand and his pistol in the other, and he was already backing toward the service door. Move! He snapped at the Scarneck man. Leave Barrett the dog. That was the second wrong choice in one sentence. Ranger heard it too. The shepherd spun from the hatch, and hit Dean low in the thigh before the sheriff could clear the threshold. The ledger bag flew again. Dean fired point blank on instinct. The shot hit Ranger high in the shoulder and drove the dog sideways into the gauge housing hard enough to ring metal through the whole room. Luke saw red. He crossed the distance in 2 strides and smashed the side of the pistol into Dean's temple, but not hard enough, not early enough, because the Scarneck man had already dragged Avery through the service door and out into the storm. Dean hit the floor, rolled, and slashed the knife hidden in his sleeve across Luke's forearm as he passed. Then he was gone too, out into the rain with one last look over his shoulder that held no panic, only insult. "Midnight," he said. "Gatehouse. Bring the drive, or the girl drowned where her father did." Then the door slammed, and the engine outside turned over. Luke went after them. Ranger's body hit his legs before he made 3 steps. Not by accident. The dog was trying to rise and couldn't. Front paws scrabbling. One shoulder pouring blood. Breath short and furious and determined anyway. Luke dropped beside him so hard his knees cracked the concrete. "Stay with me." Ranger's eyes were still bright. Still tracking the open service door, the hatch, the lowered shotgun, the living dangers first and his own wound second. That broke something in Luke worse than the knife had. Avery was gone. Grant was gone below the intake. Dean had the time, the place, and almost certainly more men. The only thing Luke had left was a bleeding German shepherd, who had already saved 3 people, and would still have crawled after a 4th. The ledger bag was gone with Dean, but the phone, Grant's first drive, and Mason's video were still in Luke's soaked jacket. Not enough for the whole story. Enough for motive. Enough for revenge. Not enough for Avery. Luke ripped open the first aid box, jammed gauze against Ranger's shoulder wound, and felt the dog tremble once under the pressure. Not from fear. From pain held too tightly. "I know," Luke whispered. "I know." Behind him the hatch roared. Grant did not come back. That silence answered the question Luke could not bear to ask out loud. Loss settled in the room like another weather system. The man he had tried to save had been taken twice in one night, once by the road, once by the water. Avery's scarf lay in the corner where she had dropped it. Mason's video sat in Luke's pocket like a blade. Ranger pressed his good side into Luke's hand, grounding him even while bleeding. "Stay here. Stay now." That was the moment Luke understood failure the right way for the first time in years. Not as proof he was cursed. Not as proof he was too slow. As proof that the men across from him planned further ahead than decency ever did, and that trying harder inside their timing would only keep feeding them. He forced himself to breathe. He bandaged Ranger tighter. He stripped the Scarneck man's dropped radio off the floor and thumbed it on. Static. Rain. Then Dean Holloway's voice, clear as a man ordering coffee. "He'll come," the sheriff said to someone off-channel. "The dog won't let him do anything else." Luke stared at the speaker until all the noise in the room narrowed to one hard line of certainty. Dean thought he understood the bond. He thought the dog made Luke predictable. Good. Let him. Luke rose slowly, Ranger limping with him after only one failed attempt to stand. The pump house smelled like wet concrete, blood, and machinery, but under all of it the dog caught something Luke hadn't. Ranger stopped by the lower hatch one last time, sniffed the spray-heavy air, then turned and went to the dead west panel Avery had opened earlier. He scratched once, then looked back. Luke followed and found, tucked behind the gauge plate and a second hidden sleeve Grant must have stashed as insurance, a second smaller drive wrapped in black tape and a child's silver bracelet engraved on the inside with 2 words, "Find home." Not map coordinates. Not names. A trigger. A message. And tucked beneath it, one more folded scrap in Grant's soaked handwriting. "If Dean takes Avery, He'll keep her where the old release alarms can't be heard from town. Ranger knows the path. Luke closed his fist around the note. Loss or failure. That was how this section had to end, with one man gone in the black water, one girl dragged into the storm, one dog bleeding but still standing, and Luke Barrett finally realizing that to get anybody back now, he would have to stop being the man who reacted and become the man who hunted. Luke never called 911. He never called county dispatch. He never called the state police either, not because he had stopped believing in law, but because Grant Quinn had died teaching him what compromised systems did to clean evidence and living witnesses. Midnight was 48 minutes away, and Dean Holloway had just enough time to bury Avery in water, paperwork, or silence if Luke gave him one official minute to work with. So he did what he had spent years telling himself he would never do again. He turned the storm into a battlefield and trusted the dog more than the map. Ranger led him out of the pump house through a maintenance cut hidden behind the old transformer shed, a path no truck could use and no civilian would even notice in the weather. The dog limped hard now, shoulder wrapped in blood-stained gauze under Luke's cut thermal sleeve, but he never once lost the line. He tracked through Laurel, down a washed-out ditch, across a dead utility corridor, and up toward the spillway ridge where the old release alarm towers stood blind over the reservoir like rusted sentries. Luke moved one pace behind, checking the drive from Grant's second hide every 30 seconds in the shelter of the trees, until the files finally opened on the phone. What he found there was not just corruption. It was architecture. Night release logs, parcel buyout maps, maintenance routes, vehicle disposal coordinates, and one folder labeled Mason. He opened it under the cover of a broken alarm box, while thunder rolled over the ridgeline. A hidden helmet cam clip loaded, date stamped the night Mason Reed died. The first seconds were chaos, black water, a flooded access tunnel, Mason breathing hard. Then the current calmed just enough for the camera to catch what he had found beneath the East Basin shelf. 2 submerged vans chained to concrete anchors, license plates removed, windows weighted. Mason cursed, reached toward the nearest one, then surfaced. The camera angle shifted. He broke into night rain beside the gate platform and shouted, "This is homicide, Dean!" The next seconds burned Luke alive from the inside. Dean Holloway stepped into frame with a private contractor in a slicker, Wes Colton, the Scarneck man from tonight, younger and meaner but unmistakable. Mason tried to get past them. Dean shot the flotation light. Wes hit Mason with a pipe. The camera went sideways. Mason rolled to the edge, still breathing, still trying to crawl. Dean looked down at him and said, very clearly, "Weather kills better than bullets." Then he kicked Mason back into the surge. Luke stopped breathing. Major reveal did not thunder into him. It locked in with terrible stillness. Mason had not died in bad conditions. Mason had been executed and washed into Luke's guilt on purpose. The sheriff knew it. Wes knew it. Grant knew it. And now Luke knew it with a kind of certainty that left no room for self-deception. Ranger pressed against his knee in the dark, warm, and wet and steady, and Luke understood the other half of the reveal too. The dog had not just led him to a submerged van tonight. Ranger had been pulling him, with all the furious loyalty in his body, toward the truth Luke had already once drowned under. He crouched, forehead against the dogs for one brief second, then rose harder than before. More files waited. One was a live maintenance feed. He opened it. Grainy black and white camera view from inside the spillway gatehouse. Avery Quinn sat tied to a chair beneath the control board, soaked, shivering, eyes wide but alive. A second camera angle showed the lower release corridor below the gatehouse. Grant Quinn, somehow still living, was caged in a maintenance basket under the spill ladder with water crashing around his waist. Luke stared. Grant hadn't gone down with the intake current after all. Dean had dropped him to the lower release chamber as part of the same machine. Bait above. Bait below. One man. One girl. One dog. And enough water to erase all of it if the timing stayed in the sheriff's hands. The last camera angle was the real knife. Dean stood in the gatehouse with Wes beside him, both of them looking up at the storm through the broken upper glass, while Avery sat restrained behind them. Dean pointed to the clock panel. Wes laughed and said, "If Barrett comes by road, he's late. If he comes by the service cut, the dog gets him here in time." Dean answered without looking back, "That's why the dog matters." Luke killed the video. The night changed shape under that sentence. Dean did understand something real, after all. Not loyalty. Not love. Timing. He knew Ranger would keep Luke coming. He had built the whole midnight exchange around that truth. Fine. Luke could use it too. Ranger barked once and turned uphill. The service path ended at a narrow drainage bridge over the spill trench, not the old suspension bridge from Another Man's Story, but a low steel grate slick with rain and vibrating under the pressure of the release chamber below. Luke went onto it without hesitation. Ranger did not. The shepherd froze at the edge, head low, nose sweeping the bolts, body rigid with warning. Luke stopped instantly. Not again. Never again. He dropped to one knee and flashed the beam along the underside. There it was, thin braided wire running under the third grate panel into a pressure switch tied to the catwalk relay box. Same logic. Different water. Wes Colton had a signature. Luke smiled once, not from joy but from the clarity of finally seeing the enemy's handwriting. "Good boy," he said. Ranger touched his wrist. Luke bypassed the grate on the concrete pipe lip beside it, one boot width at a time, while the dog took the opposite wall and kept his wounded shoulder clear of the wire. Beyond the bridge sat the spillway gatehouse, all black windows and old brick, half swallowed by rain and roaring water. One light burned upstairs. Another blinked below where Grant was caged. Wes had likely rigged the main door. Dean would be watching the road. But the dog had not led Luke to the road. He had led him to the blind side above the alarm tower, and the dead maintenance stairs nobody used anymore. Major reveal came with a second gift there. Luke now knew the whole structure of the trap. The only question left was whether he could break it before midnight and get Avery and Grant out alive. Ranger looked back at him from the foot of the stairs, breathing hard, eyes bright despite the blood crusting his shoulder wrap. Luke checked the pistol, tucked the drives deeper into his inner jacket, and followed the dog up into the rain toward the place where all the buried truth in Black Hollow had decided to wait for him. The first man Luke dropped at the gatehouse never saw him. He saw Ranger. That was the point. The wounded shepherd limped out into the spillway floodlight just far enough for the sentry on the lower catwalk to shift his aim downward in easy contempt, probably thinking he had one more half-dead animal to finish tonight. Ranger held exactly 3 seconds, then barked once and moved left. Luke came from above on the maintenance stairs, hit the sentry in the throat with the pistol frame, and shoved him soundlessly into the spill mist below before the body fully understood what had happened. High danger did not arrive as screaming or explosions this time. It arrived as silence bought by inches. Luke dragged the sentry into the shadow of the alarm housing, stripped the key ring and radio, and moved along the upper wall while Ranger stayed parallel 2 levels down, reading every angle faster than a man with maps ever could. Through the upper gatehouse window Luke saw Avery first, still tied to the chair, head turned toward the storm, like she was trying to hear something beyond the building. Dean sat at the far console, boots on the rung, revolver laid across his thigh, listening to the old reservoir speakers crackle static. Wes was not in the room. That made him more dangerous. Luke tried the side service door. Locked. Ranger stopped below the stairwell and barked once at the drain grate beside the lower turbine panel. Luke looked. Fresh scrape marks. Wes. Under the stairs, not away. He leaned over the rail, saw the shotgun muzzle beginning to rise from the shadowed maintenance crawl under the grating, and fired first. The round blew sparks off steel. Wes rolled, cursed, and fired blind. The buckshot shredded the stair balusters, and one pellet punched through Luke's sleeve, hot as a hornet. Avery screamed inside the gatehouse. Dean shot to his feet. Ranger launched under the great opening, with a snarl so violent the whole lower catwalk rang. The dog disappeared into shadow with Wes, and the next 3 seconds were all metal, boots barking, and the kind of close-quarter chaos no clean story ever survives. Luke kicked through the side window before Dean could reach Avery. Glass blew inward. Dean fired once. Luke felt the round burn past his ribs and bury into the control map behind him. He hit the floor rolling, came up behind the support column, and saw Dean wrench Avery's chair backward toward the main release switchboard. Smart. Put the girl between the gun and the gate controls. You're late, Dean said, breath even, like this was all still a scheduling issue. Grant should have taught you timing better. Luke fired low through the chair legs. One round snapped the front rung. Avery, and the chair tipped sideways. Dean lost his human shield for half a heartbeat, and that half heartbeat was enough. Luke drove across the room, hit Dean into the control cabinet, and the two of them slammed into the lever bank hard enough to make warning lights flash red across the whole gatehouse. Down below, Ranger burst out from under the stair crawl trailing Wes Colton by his damaged raincoat sleeve. Wes had blood all over one cheek and a knife in one hand now, shotgun gone. He saw Avery on the floor and changed direction instantly. New danger. Ranger saw it too, and cut him off with the last thing he should have left in that wounded shoulder. The impact knocked Wes into the lower switch rail just as his hand slashed downward. The knife never reached Avery. It reached the emergency bypass latch instead. Every siren in the spillway woke at once. A brutal alarm filled the night. The lower release gates began opening under automatic override. Grant Quinn's cage light blinked red on the lower monitor. Water in the release corridor surged from waist to chest height in seconds. No! Avery screamed, not for herself this time. For her father. High danger had found its true shape. Luke drove his elbow into Dean's jaw, ripped the revolver free, and turned toward the lower monitor. Grant was still there, caged under the spill ladder, body slammed by white water as the level climbed. Wes laughed through blood below them. Now you pick, he shouted. Hero or witness? Dean lunged for the dead man panel on the far console. Luke shot the control board instead of the sheriff. Sparks exploded. Half the upper lights died. The gate alarms kept screaming. Ranger pinned Wes for 1 second, maybe 2, then looked up at Luke, at Avery, and at the lower monitor where Grant's head kept vanishing underwater and returning. The dog's eyes made the choice first. Not the console. Not Dean. Below. Luke understood and hated him for being right, because it meant leaving one danger for another. He cut Avery free in one slash, shoved the revolver into her hand butt first, and said, Only if he touches the main wheel. Then he ran for the lower spill stairs with Ranger at his side. Dean came off the broken console with murder in his face. Avery, soaked and shaking and half-fallen, still pulled the trigger. The shot missed Dean, but punched through the glass clock face over the release board, showering the room in exploding numbers, and stopping the old mechanical timer dead at 11:57. Below, Luke and Ranger hit the spill stairs as the catwalk itself began to tremble under the opening gates. Grant's cage was only 30 feet away and a whole river beyond reach. Luke slid the last 5 steps, clipped his rescue line to the lower rail, and went over the side into the spray. The current hit like a truck. Ranger barked once above him, and then did the impossible again, limped across the outer maintenance lip, not into the water, but along the rail above the cage, trying to get angle on the release lock while Luke fought his way hand over hand through the torrent. Grant lifted his head long enough to see them, and mouthed something Luke couldn't hear. Maybe run. Maybe sorry. Maybe Avery. It did not matter. Luke reached the cage bar, got one arm through, and realized the truth a fraction too late. The cage wasn't only locked. It was bolted to the release ladder with a collapsible shear pin. One clean cut, and the whole basket would drop into the whitewater chute below. Wes knew that. Dean knew that. Another machine built to make rescue look possible, until the exact second it became fatal. High danger ended there, with Luke hanging off a shaking spill ladder over black water, Grant drowning inside a rigged cage, Ranger bleeding and balanced on a rail 3 feet above the release pin, Dean coming down the stairs behind them through alarm light and broken glass, and Avery alone upstairs with a revolver she had never meant to fire. Then Ranger lowered his head to the cage latch, sniffed once, and started pawing not at the visible lock, but at the pipe bracket above it, exactly where no human hand would have looked first in that spray. Luke followed Ranger's line, because this was the moment he finally stopped needing the dog to earn belief. Above the visible cage lock, hidden under years of lime scale and spill spray, sat a narrow release sleeve welded into the pipe bracket. Not standard. Added. Wes's work. The visible padlock held the door. The bracket release held the basket. Separate systems. Rescue if you knew which was which. Death if you guessed in panic. Luke jammed the dive knife into the scale crust, ripped until metal flashed through, and felt the sleeve move under the blade. Up above, Dean hit the lower platform and aimed down at Luke's spine. Avery screamed something Luke couldn't make out. The gunshot came a beat later. Dean jerked sideways instead of Luke. Avery had fired again from the upper stairs. Not a killing shot. Enough. Enough to throw his aim, and by one more second. Wes roared from the catwalk shadows, and slammed into Avery from the blind side before she could fire a third time. The revolver spun over the rail and vanished into the spill mist. Near resolution seemed close enough to touch. Grant inches from rescue, Dean wounded, Avery armed, and then the whole thing twisted again. Wes got a hand around Avery's throat, dragged her backward toward the upper emergency wheel, and shouted over the alarms. Move one more inch, and I open full release. New twist. New geometry. Luke froze at the cage. Ranger froze on the rail, but only for the tiniest fraction. Then the dog turned from Grant, turned from the drowning man he had helped drag Luke toward, and locked onto Avery instead. That choice hurt, but it was right. Grant saw it too. Through spray and blood and water, he looked not angry, not afraid, just clear. Take the girl, he shouted. Luke hated that everybody noble kept making sense on nights like this. Dean wiped blood from his temple with the back of his hand and laughed once, breathless now, but still full of poison. This is why I always liked water, he said. It makes morals impossible. Luke ignored him. He slid the knife deeper into the bracket sleeve and twisted. Metal popped. Not the basket. The hidden secondary catch above it. Grant's cage dropped 2 inches, then held. Good. The real death pin was still lower. Avery choked out Luke's name from above. Wes dragged her to the upper wheel, knife against her jaw now, forcing her to watch the water climbing around her father. Dean stepped down one more stair, gun back in his hand despite the shoulder wound from Avery's miss. Drop the knife, he said, or I'll make this quicker for all of you. Luke did the only thing Dean did not expect. He looked at Ranger. Not at the gun. Not at Wes. At the dog. Ranger's ears were forward, Not toward Avery this time, but toward the dead alarm cable running from the upper wheel housing into the side maintenance cabinet. The dog barked once, sharp and exact. Remote assist. Luke saw it a half-second later, an auxiliary wheel motor line that bypassed the manual lock when alarm mode cut in. Hidden, but live. If he could jam the motor, Wes would lose the leverage of the wheel without understanding why. He took the risk. "Grant!" Luke yelled. "When the cage shifts, tuck left!" Then he ripped the knife free from the bracket and threw it not at Wes, not at Dean, but at the live motor line Ranger had marked. The blade cut insulation, and the cabinet blew white sparks. The upper wheel seized with a scream. Wes instinctively looked down at the jam. Ranger launched. The dog hit him high and sideways, tearing Avery out of the killing line as both bodies crashed into the dead clock housing. Dean fired on reflex. The round went low through the spray and punched the spill rail where Luke's head had been. Luke moved in the same instant. He dropped from the ladder onto the cage frame, drove both boots into the brass tip pin, and snapped it. The basket swung free, not down into the chute, but outward on its retained safety hinge, exactly as Grant had probably prayed it still could. Grant slammed hard against the rail and almost went under, but Luke had him by the vest before the current could finish the job. Up above, Avery crawled clear. Wes fought under Ranger with one arm between his throat and the dog's jaws, and Dean advanced with the gun out and murder finally stripped bare on his face. "You keep choosing wrong people to save," he said. Luke hauled Grant onto the spill stairs by pure violence of will and shoved him upward one rung at a time. "No," he said, looking straight at the sheriff now. "I just kept listening to the wrong men." Dean aimed for Grant first. That was his mistake. Ranger saw the angle before Luke could turn fully. The Black and Tan Shepherd broke off Wes and hit Dean at the wrist with the last clean burst of force left in his body. The shot blew out the spillway spotlight instead of Grant's spine. Darkness swallowed half the platform. Wes rose with blood all over him and lunged for Avery again, but Grant, half drowned, half frozen, still somehow alive enough, grabbed the dropped maintenance bar from the stairs and swung it into Wes's knee so hard the man folded with a scream. The whole night suddenly tipped. Dean lost the gun. Wes lost his leverage. Avery had the wheel room behind her again. Grant was out of the cage. Near resolution seemed real for one breathtaking second. Then the emergency cabinet above the upper platform clanged open by itself under alarm release, and a red warning strobe flooded the spillway wall. Auto full gate override. Dean saw it first and smiled through blood. "Failsafe," he said. "Should have watched the older systems." One more twist. If the override engaged, every lower gate would fully open in 60 seconds whether Dean stood or fell. The reservoir would rip the valley channel apart before dawn, wash the caged evidence shelf clean, and kill anyone still on the lower stairs. Luke looked up at the screaming red light, at Avery shaking beside the jammed wheel, at Grant barely conscious on the steps, at Ranger bleeding and still growling between all of them and Dean. 58 seconds. 57. Dean backed toward the service ladder with both hands open now, not surrendering, just retreating toward one last route of control. "You can have me," he said, "or you can have the town." Near resolution had become choice again, but this time Luke saw something in Ranger's stance that changed it. The dog wasn't looking at Dean. He was looking at the underfloor maintenance hatch beneath the override cabinet, the one route nobody had used because no human had thought to. Luke understood. Not Dean first. System first. He shoved Avery the dead revolver anyway, got Grant's arm over the stair rail, and ran for the underfloor hatch as Ranger took Dean's path away with a snarl that promised the sheriff one thing only, that if he wanted to keep writing endings with water, he would have to step through the dog to do it. The underfloor hatch was welded by neglect, not design, and that saved them. A design lock would have cost tools and time. Neglect only cost pain. Luke tore the maintenance bar out of Grant's grip with a muttered apology, jammed it under the hatch seam, and drove down until old steel popped with a sound like a bone giving way. Freezing spray hit his face as the panel lifted. Inside, beneath the override cabinet, sat the actual system Dean had trusted more than guns, weather, or men, an antique manual flood cam linked by chain to the autogate clutch, with one emergency governor pin holding the whole full release cycle from locking in permanently. Ranger barked once from behind Luke, urgent and exact. Dean was moving again. Luke didn't look. He dropped both knees into the crawl space, reached for the governor pin, and found it jammed solid under a century of rust and a minute of panic. Above him Avery shouted. Wes screamed. Grant coughed himself half apart. Ranger's growl turned savage. Luke pulled. Nothing. He reset his grip, braced one boot against the housing, and yanked again hard enough to tear skin off his palm. The pin moved 1 hateful millimeter. 41 seconds. Then Ranger made a different sound. Not a bark, not a growl, but the low explosive warning he only used when death changed lanes. Luke twisted half out of the crawl, just in time, to see Dean Holloway charging the platform, with a backup revolver drawn from his ankle holster. Not running from the dog. Running through him. The sheriff fired at Ranger point blank. The shot missed only because Grant Quinn, barely able to stand, used the last clean strength in his body to slam the maintenance bar into Dean's forearm from the side. The gun flew over the rail and disappeared into the spray. Dean turned and drove Grant backward into the spill ladder hard enough to send both men crashing to the landing. Avery grabbed for the dead revolver on instinct, remembered it was empty, and instead threw herself at the emergency wheel to keep it from unlocking. Wes Colton crawled for her, with one knee ruined and murder still in his face. Ranger chose Avery. Again. The dog hit Wes in the chest and pinned him against the red strobe wall in a storm of teeth and fury and blood. Luke chose the system. Finally, he dropped back into the crawl and drove the maintenance bar itself through the governor ring as a lever. Metal screamed. The pin snapped free. The auto full gate clutch disengaged with a concussion-like thud that rolled through the spillway beneath his knees. The override strobe died. The main gate stopped opening. The water did not calm at once, but it stopped becoming worse. Emotional closure didn't arrive there yet. Justice did first. Luke came out of the crawl as Dean, wild now and stripped down to the ugliest man left inside him, lunged for Avery with both hands. No authority. No badged voice. Just desperation. Luke crossed the platform and hit him before the sheriff could get fingers around her throat. They went down hard on the wet steel. Dean still knew how to fight ugly. Headbutt. Elbow. Thumb to the cut under Luke's ribs. But he was fighting a man who had stopped wasting seconds trying to make corrupt men act like decent ones. Luke broke the sheriff's nose with the first clean punch, hammered his wrist into the rail with the second, and drove him flat onto the catwalk with the third. Dean spat blood and rain and laughed anyway, because men like him mistook delay for immortality. "You think the files matter?" he choked out. "Half this county signed the checks." Luke almost hit him again. Almost. Then Ranger's bark cut through everything. The dog had Wes down, Avery clear, Grant alive on one knee, and still he was looking not at the people, but at the reservoir beyond the spill wall, toward the dark basin where the drowned rode, and the submerged van lay somewhere under rain and black water. The meaning landed with breathtaking simplicity. The van. The east shelf. The chained vehicles Mason had seen. The truth wasn't only in drives and letters and men who could talk. It was still out there in the water, physical, recoverable, undeniable. Dean saw Luke understand, and finally looked afraid. Not of prison. Of evidence that did not depend on witnesses he could drown. Luke hauled him upright, and zip-tied his wrists, with the emergency restraint stripped from the override cabinet. Avery stood shaking under the storm, soaked to the bone, eyes huge, but alive. Grant dragged himself to the rail and looked down at the water with the expression of a man who had spent months begging to be believed and had finally run out of breath before he ran out of truth. Ranger limped to Luke's side and leaned hard into his leg for the first time all night, not pushing him toward a clue now, not commanding a new route, just staying there, warm and breathing and real. That nearly undid him. Sirens finally reached the spillway 7 minutes later, distant at first, then closer, not county this time but state units and county units from North District, the ones Dean did not own. Luke had used Grant's uploaded maintenance feed from the phone the second the override died. Mason's video, the gate logs, Avery's capture cam, everything went out together before anyone could bury it again. By dawn, divers were already setting marker buoys over the East Basin shelf. Grant was on oxygen but alive. Avery sat under a thermal blanket with one hand buried in Ranger's neck fur like she was afraid he might vanish if she let go. Wes went out on a stretcher with a brace on his ruined leg and murder still failing to save him. Dean Holloway went out in handcuffs under floodlights bright enough to make lying difficult. And Luke Barrett sat on the wet spillway steps with a bandage under his ribs, reservoir water drying stiff on his jeans, and Ranger's head resting across his boot as if the dog had finally decided the running was over. The sun came up gray over Black Hollow, thin at first through the storm leftovers, then stronger, turning the surface of the reservoir from black metal into something almost honest. Grant came over on one crutch sometime after dawn, and lowered himself onto the step beside Luke with the slowness of a man whose body had paid too much for the right to sit in daylight. "I used you," he said quietly. Luke did not answer right away. Ranger lifted his head, looked from one man to the other, then settled again. "Yeah," Luke said finally. "You did." Grant swallowed. "I knew if Ranger got to you, you'd come." Luke looked out over the basin, where the divers' buoys now rocked over the hidden shelf. Mason Reed's death. The drowned vehicles. The submerged van. Every buried thing coming back up one line at a time, because a German shepherd refused to let a stranger walk away from the wrong patch of water. "You were right about one thing," Luke said. "I did come." Grant nodded, eyes red not just from the cold. "And I was wrong about another." Luke looked at him. Grant managed the smallest, saddest smile of the entire night. "I thought the dog was bringing you to save me." He glanced down at Ranger, then back toward Avery under her blanket by the ambulance. "Turns out he was bringing all of us to the truth." Luke looked down at Ranger then, really looked, at the blood dried in the shoulder fur, the mud under the claws, the old intelligence in the eyes that had started the whole night by standing in a road and refusing to give up on something drowning where no one else was looking. He slid one hand under the dog's jaw, and the shepherd lifted his head into it without resistance. "You weren't stray at all," Luke whispered. Avery heard him from the ambulance step and answered softly through the blanket and the morning. "No," she said. "He just knew where home was." That was the line that finished it. Not the arrests. Not the divers. Not the state troopers photographing the spillway controls. Home. Luke had come to the reservoir because water was the one place he could punish himself in peace. He was leaving it with the truth about Mason, a town finally forced to see what had been hidden beneath its own surface, a living girl who had not drowned, a living father who had not been erased, and a black-antenned shepherd who had dragged him out of guilt and into purpose one soaked step at a time. By noon, the first recovered evidence van was breaking the reservoir surface under a crane line, while cameras rolled and officials stopped pretending weather had killed the wrong people by coincidence. Luke stood with Avery and Grant on the embankment, Ranger between them, and watched the black water give up what it had been forced to hide. Some endings came with gunfire, some with quartz. This one came with metal rising slow from the reservoir, and a dog finally relaxing enough to sit. Grant eventually put one hand on Luke's shoulder and said Avery could stay with her aunt in town until things settled. Then he looked at Ranger. The dog did not go to him. He stayed pressed to Luke's knee, eyes on the water, then on Avery, then back on Luke as if he had made his own decision about where he belonged next. Avery smiled through everything she had lost and everything she had somehow kept. "I think he picked you," she said. Luke wanted to argue. Wanted to say no dog that loyal left his family. But Ranger only lifted one paw and rested it over Luke's boot with the same steady pressure he had used all night whenever the next right choice mattered. Luke laughed once through a chest full of things too heavy to name. "Yeah," he said softly, hand buried in the dog's wet fur as the reservoir wind finally lost its bite. "I think maybe he did."